In the late 16th century, over 100 people crossed the Atlantic Ocean in search of a new life. They built homes. They raised families. They believed they were laying the foundation for England's future in the New World. And then, they vanished. No graves were ever found. No bodies were recovered. No written explanation was left behind. When help finally arrived, 3 years too late, the settlement was silent. Not burned, not destroyed, simply gone. The only clue was a single word carved into wood: Croatoan. This wasn't a military retreat. This wasn't an evacuation ordered by a crown. This was an entire civilian colony. Men, women, and children disappearing without explanation. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to them. Tonight, we reopen one of history's oldest cold cases. This is Roanoke, the colony that vanished. By the 1580s, Europe was locked in a race for dominance that stretched far beyond its borders. Spain had already established powerful colonies throughout the Americas, extracting immense wealth and controlling critical trade routes. England, watching from across the Channel, was falling behind, and falling behind meant vulnerability. Queen Elizabeth I needed a foothold in the New World, not just for profit, but for survival. A permanent English presence in North America would weaken Spain's influence, provide a base for privateers, and signal that England was a global power. That responsibility fell to Sir Walter Raleigh. In 1584, English explorers were sent to scout potential locations along the Atlantic coast. They returned with reports of a small island off the coast of present-day North Carolina, Roanoke Island. On maps, it seemed ideal: coastal access, navigable waterways, and defensible terrain. In reality, it was dangerous. In 1585, England made its first attempt to settle the island. This initial colony was composed mostly of soldiers and craftsmen, led by Ralph Lane, a military commander tasked with holding the land and preparing it for future settlement. From the beginning, things went wrong. The settlers arrived late in the growing season, leaving little time to plant crops. Supplies dwindled quickly. Survival depended almost entirely on trade with nearby indigenous tribes. At first, relations were cautious but cooperative. That cooperation didn't last. Misunderstandings escalated. Food shortages bred suspicion. Lane, increasingly paranoid about an uprising, ordered a preemptive attack on a local leader. It was a catastrophic decision. Trust collapsed overnight. Trade stopped. Tribes that once helped the English now avoided, or openly opposed, them. Starvation followed. By 1586, the colony was on the brink of collapse. When an English fleet happened to pass the coast after raiding Spanish settlements, the colonists made a desperate decision. They abandoned Roanoke entirely and returned to England. The island was left empty. England's first colony had failed, and in doing so, it left behind resentment, mistrust, and unresolved tension that would directly shape what came next. In 1587, England made a critical shift in its colonization strategy. The first Roanoke attempt had been built on soldiers and survival. The second would be built on families and permanence. This was no longer an outpost. It was meant to be a home. More than 115 settlers prepared to cross the Atlantic together. Unlike the first expedition, these were not hardened military men expecting a return voyage. These were ordinary people: craftsmen, farmers, laborers, wives, and children, bringing what little they owned into an uncertain future. Some sold their belongings to afford the journey. Some left behind relatives they would never see again. Some believed they were stepping into opportunity. Others likely feared they were stepping into exile. A transatlantic voyage in the 1500s was brutal. The journey could take months. Ships were cramped, damp, and disease spread easily. Food spoiled. Water stagnated. Storms could toss vessels like driftwood. By the time they sighted land, many settlers were already exhausted, physically and mentally. But hope waited on that shoreline. The settlement was led by John White, appointed governor. White was not a soldier, but an artist and cartographer. He had spent time in the region before and documented its landscapes and people through detailed drawings. His role was not just to govern, but to observe, to record England's first true foothold in North America. But reality settled in quickly. The land was unfamiliar. The soil did not behave like English farmland. Crops struggled. Hunting required knowledge they didn't yet have, and the memory of the first colony's violence still lingered among local tribes. Some indigenous groups were cautious but willing to trade. Others remembered English aggression and wanted distance. The colonists stood on fragile ground, socially and physically. Every meal depended on cooperation. Every winter depended on preparation. Every day depended on survival. And as weeks passed, it became painfully clear. This colony was not ready to stand alone. Supplies were running low. Food was uncertain. Morale was fragile. They needed help from England, and that meant sending someone back across the ocean. That responsibility fell to the one man they trusted most, John White. He would leave behind not only the colony, but his own daughter and his newborn granddaughter. He promised to return quickly. No one imagined it would take 3 years. Before John White prepared to leave, the colony faced a reality they could no longer ignore. Their supplies were running low. Crops had not produced enough. Trade with nearby tribes was uncertain and fragile. If they stayed without resupply, starvation was a real possibility. If they left the island without a plan, they might never be found again. So the colonists agreed on something simple. If they needed to relocate, they would leave a message behind. They would carve their destination into a tree, a post, or a visible structure. Something durable enough to survive weather and time. A word, a name, a direction. And if they were forced to leave under danger, they would carve a Maltese cross beside the message. The cross would mean, "We did not leave willingly." It was their insurance policy. A signal to whoever returned. A silent agreement between those who might be separated by years. When he boarded the ship in late 1587, he did so believing he would return within months. He reassured the settlers. He reassured his daughter. He left behind his family, including his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, with the promise that he would return with food, tools, and support. To the colonists, this was not goodbye. It was a temporary sacrifice for survival. But the Atlantic Ocean did not care about promises. Back in England, White's plans unraveled quickly. War with Spain dominated the country's attention. The Spanish Armada threatened invasion, and nearly every seaworthy ship was seized for defense or privateering. White tried repeatedly to secure passage back to Roanoke. He pleaded. He negotiated. He waited. Months passed, then years. What was meant to be a short absence stretched into 3 long years. And with every passing season, the likelihood grew that the colony he left behind was facing the New World alone. By the time White finally secured a ship in 1590, he understood the truth. If the colony still existed, it had survived without him far longer than anyone planned. But he still believed one thing. they would have left a message. They had a plan. In August of 1590, John White's ship approached Roanoke Island. The silence was immediate and unsettling. No smoke rose from cooking fires. No voices echoed through the trees. No movement lined the shore. When White stepped onto land, the settlement appeared strangely orderly. Homes were gone, but not destroyed. Wooden structures had been carefully dismantled, as if the colonists had intentionally salvaged materials for reuse. Supplies were missing. Personal belongings were gone. There were no signs of panic, no evidence of violence. Whatever happened here, it wasn't chaos. Then White found it. Carved deeply into a wooden post was a single word: Croatoan. Nearby was a partial carving: C-R-O. This wasn't random. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island and the indigenous tribe that lived there, one that had previously shown friendliness toward the settlers. And just as important as what was carved was what wasn't. There was no Maltese cross, no warning, no sign of fear, no indication of force. To White, this suggested the colonists had left deliberately, possibly seeking safety, not fleeing it. He was desperate to continue the search, to sail to Croatoan Island, to find his daughter, his granddaughter, the people he had left behind. But once again, fate intervened. A violent storm battered the ship, snapping ropes and damaging sails. The crew, fearful of being stranded themselves, refused to continue. Against his will, John White was forced to leave. Roanoke faded into the distance, and with it, the last confirmed sighting of the colony. Today we still wonder what could have possibly happened to the lone colony, and what fate they had come across. The most widely accepted explanation is also the least dramatic. The colonists may not have died at all. They may have simply blended in. The word Croatoan strongly suggests the settlers relocated to Croatoan Island, roughly 50 miles south of Roanoke. The Croatoan tribe had previously maintained friendlier relations with the English than many neighboring groups. For starving settlers, the choice may have been simple: leave or die. Joining a tribe would have offered food, protection, and a chance at survival. Over time, English customs could have faded. Language could have been lost. Generations might grow up never knowing their ancestors came from across an ocean. There are clues that support this possibility. Later European explorers reported meeting indigenous groups with unusual physical traits: gray eyes, lighter skin tones, features uncommon among surrounding populations. Some tribes even told stories of ancestors who could read from books. English tools have been discovered far inland, suggesting movement away from the coast. But assimilation raises unsettling questions. If they survived, why didn't they return? Why didn't any written record emerge? Why did the colony vanish so completely from history? Assimilation explains survival. It does not fully explain silence. While exploring another theory, it's difficult to talk about early colonial history without acknowledging the ever-present possibility of violence. Some researchers believe the settlers were attacked by hostile tribes seeking revenge for the brutality of the first colony. The English had already spilled blood here. Trust had been broken long before the families arrived. One chilling historical account comes from Chief Powhatan, leader of a powerful regional confederacy. Years later, he reportedly told English colonists at Jamestown that he had ordered the destruction of a group of settlers living among rival tribes. He even presented English artifacts as proof. But historians remain divided on this claim, because here is the problem with the massacre theory. Mass killings leave evidence: burned structures, weapons, graves. Roanoke shows none of these. The settlement appeared deliberately dismantled, not destroyed in panic, which suggests that if violence did occur, it likely happened somewhere else. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the hardest to confront. They may have just run out of food. Tree ring data reveals that the late 1580s brought one of the worst droughts the region had experienced in centuries. Crops would have failed. Hunting would become unreliable. Even local tribes struggled during extreme drought, meaning there was less food to trade. Starvation changes people. It erodes reason, destroys unity. The colonists may have abandoned Roanoke not because they wanted to, but because staying meant certain death. What followed could have been a desperate migration, families pushing into unfamiliar territory, hoping to find help before their strength gave out. History is filled with expeditions that simply never arrive. Not every tragedy leaves bones behind. Sometimes the land takes them. Roanoke endures not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. More than 115 people vanished. Families, children, an entire community. All that remains is a word carved into wood. Croatoan. Was it a destination? A plea for help? Or the last thing they thought someone might understand? Roanoke reminds us that history doesn't always give closure. Sometimes, it just disappears.